Welcome back. Hopefully you guys enjoyed Tim's videos on phonetics, and now that you're familiar with phones and the IPA, we can go on to talk about how the mind organizes sounds. In this lecture, we're going to cover phonotactics and syllable structure, specifically in the English language. Have you ever wondered why words like cat or bottle are fine, but words like come off from it don't really sound good in English? Or maybe why it's okay to say something like psychology in Greek, but we would say psychology in English? Or even why, when the Japanese borrowed the word cake from English, it turned into keiki. Well, welcome to the fun world of phonotactics. Phonotactics is the study of how sounds are allowed to pattern in a language. In English, we have lots of rules that allow certain sounds to occur before or after other sounds, depending on where they occur within a syllable. For example, the engma or ing sound never starts a word. Conversely, the h or h sound never ends a word, at least in English. We can use phonotactics and syllable structure to explain why this is in a particular language. To start though, let's talk about what exactly a syllable is. A syllable is something that lots of people intuitively use and know in English, but when asked what it actually is, they fail to produce a definition that is cohesive, let alone useful. In linguistics, we have defined a syllable as a unit of sound we use to analyze languages. A syllable can be a useful tool to help explain why certain sound sequences are allowed, or why stress occurs in some places but not others. Syllables are tools that can be used for every language, although some languages make use of alternative tools, such as moire. We're not going to talk a whole lot about moire, but they're an alternative unit of sound. In linguistics, a syllable is then defined as a collection of sounds with a single sonorous peak, which is only really useful if you know what the word sonorous means, and I don't think most people do. So let's talk a bit about sonority. Sonority is the feature of a sound that refers to how vowel-like a sound is. Ideally, the more obstruction there is in the vocal tract, the less sonorous a sound is. The actual physical and acoustic properties of sonority are not very well understood, but for now, we can describe sonority as a cline or a type of hierarchy where some sounds are more sonorous than others. The so-called sonority hierarchy is described as follows. At the bottom of the hierarchy is stops and affricates. These have the most obstruction, so they're said to be the least sonorous. Above stops is fricatives. Above fricatives are nasals. Above nasals are liquids. Above liquids are glides. And then above glides are finally vowels, which are the most vowel-like. I've put a number next to each of these. So 0 is the least sonorous, 5 is the most sonorous. And this will be useful for a little bit of what we're going to see in this lecture. This is an idealization, and it's not complete, and it doesn't necessarily work in every case. But for Linguistics 101, it's going to do, and so we're going to stick with this definition of sonority. The rest of this section is going to focus on English phonotactics and syllable shapes. Now, although this is focused on English, the general concept can be applied to most languages. Let's take a simple word like cat. We'll spell it out in the IPA using slashes because right now we're not talking about the very specific pronunciations of each of these sounds, but just the sounds in general. And let's take a look at how sonority can help us determine whether or not this is a syllable, if it's two syllables, and what's going on generally with it. We can see the first sound here, the k, is a 0 on the sonority hierarchy. We're going to write that underneath, and this is telling us that it is a complete obstruction and is not sonorous. The ash or the ah sound that follows is a 5 because it is a vowel and it is the most sonorous. And then finally, the T is, again, a complete obstruction, and so is a complete lack of sonority, so we give it a number of 0. If we look at this sequence, we see 0, 5, 0, and we can see a sort of peak. There's a single peak that rises at the start and then drops to the end. Because we've defined a syllable as a unit of sound with a single sonorous peak, we would say that this unit, this word cat, is a single syllable. The peak of sonority in a syllable is referred to as a nucleus. Every syllable, regardless of the language, has a nucleus. Nuclei, which is just the plural form of nucleus, are usually, but not always, vowels. To help us analyze syllable structures, we can create syllable trees that make use of nuclei and the sonority scale. We can start diagramming by first identifying the nucleus of a syllable. Now we know in this case, in the word cat, that it is a, and so we will denote it with the letter N for nucleus. The next component of any syllable is the onset. Onsets are consonants that come before the nucleus. An onset is optional in English and other languages. In the word at, for example, there is no onset. We're going to abbreviate onsets with the letter O. The final piece of a syllable is called the coda. The coda is the unit of consonants that come after the nucleus. Codas can have multiple sounds in them, or they can be a single sound. Note that although onsets and codas can have multiple sounds in them, nuclei can only be made up of a single sound. Where there's a diphthong, we're going to say that that's a single sound. Like onsets, codas are optional in English and many other languages. In fact, some languages don't allow codas in most cases. This is often the case in Japanese, which is why when they took the word cake from English, they added an I to the end. We got keiki. By adding this extra vowel, the coda has actually become the onset of a second syllable. No language requires codas. We're going to abbreviate codas with the letter C. Nuclei and codas together form what is called the rhyme. It sounds similar to the word rhyme, because it is the same word, because it refers to the unit that causes words to rhyme. Words with similar rhymes rhyme. And we're going to abbreviate this R. Note that in a case where there is only a nucleus and there is no coda, the rhyme still exists. It simply contains only the nucleus. Finally, the onset and the rhyme join together at the top to form the syllable, which we use the symbol sigma to represent. This really just means the syllable as the whole. Now, building up a syllable is much easier with a single syllable word. You only have to do one. But if we wanted to mark the syllables in a multisyllabic word, or a word with many syllables, it gets a little bit more tricky. So let's take the word dragon, for example. We have the word dragon written in broad IPA here, and the first step is to plot out the hierarchy of this word. So if we take a look at the sonority scale that we had, we will see that the letter D is a 0 because it's a stop. The sound R or R is a 3 as it's a liquid. The vowel A or the letter E is a 5 as it's a vowel. The stop G is a 0. The vowel I is a 5. And the consonant N or N is a 2. We can see that this word has two peaks that correspond with the two vowels, A and I. Because there are two peaks, we know that this word has two syllables. There are two nuclei, which means there must be two syllables. Next, let's determine the onsets. Starting with the first syllable, the onset is fairly obvious. It's the first two sounds at the start of the word, dra. Unlike our last example, this is what we call a complex onset, which just means that it has more than one sound. The next question is, what do we do with the g? Is it the onset of the second syllable or the coda of the first? In general, phonology follows a principle of maximizing the onset. This means that we want to put as many sounds as we can into the onset of a syllable. The way to determine if a language allows a sound in the onset, and thus that we can put those sounds in the onset, is to think of words that start with the sound. So, in this example, we want to figure out, is g the coda of the first syllable, or do we maximize the onset and put it in the onset of the second syllable? Well, are there any English words that start with g? You might think, well, what about gel, spelled G-E-L? Well, although it's spelled with the G, it's not actually the sound g. So, are there any other words that start with g? How about gone, or gold, or even gore? All of these are valid English words. These tell us that yes, we can have an onset with a g. So, we're going to maximize the onset in this case and say that the G in the word dragon is the onset of the second syllable. Let's throw in a period or a dot there just to show us that there's two syllables and where they split. This is going to make it a bit easier to diagram the rest of the tree. So, the last sound that we have remaining is at the end of the word, and it's an N. We know that this must be a coda because it's a consonant at the end of the word. So, we'll notate it as such, and then we can build up rhymes for each syllable. In the first syllable, we only have a nucleus with no coda. This means that the rhyme is made up only of that nucleus. We can do the same thing then, building a rhyme in the second syllable, and then build that up to a full syllable by joining the onsets with the rhymes. Let's talk a bit about how we know what sounds can create valid onsets and codas in English. Although we have one tool, which is, well, can this particular sound be used at the start of a word? In general, we can use what is called the Sonority Sequencing Principle, or the SSP. The SSP tells us that syllables tend to build from the least sonorous to the most sonorous, leading up to the nuclei. This means that something like clay is a fine syllable in English, as it goes from a 0 to a 3 to a 5. There's a steady rising peak. On the other hand, something like ifke is not acceptable. Note that it does not have a steady rising peak. So then, how about something like ski? Well, ski is a valid word, but it doesn't really have a steady rising peak because it goes from a 1 to a 0 to a 5. Well, this is because, and I swear to you, this is largely the justification that is used in the literature, the sound s is weird. It's weird across languages, and it's weird in English. And you might be thinking to yourself, well, how is the sonority sequencing principle really valid if it just doesn't work with the letter S or the sound S? And to that I would say that science is hard and we're trying our best. In English, the sonority sequencing principle can essentially be ignored when an onset starts with the letter S. When an onset starts with an S, it can then be followed by any voiceless stop. After a voiceless stop, you can have a liquid, although at this point it's starting to follow the sonority sequencing principle again. So what you should know is that if you have a s at the beginning of an onset, it doesn't necessarily have to rise in sonority. It can go down to a voiceless consonant, and then it can start rising in sonority again up to the nucleus. And we see something similar in codas, actually. we would expect a falling sonority in codas. If we take a look at the word clank, we see that we have the progression 0, 3, 5, 2, 0. We've got a nice rise up to the nucleus, and then from the nucleus we have a nice fall in sonority. However, s messes things up here too. In English and in other languages, we allow words like the word straights, where the progression is 1, 0, 3, 5, 0, 1. So we see that we start at a 1, then we go down in sonority, then back up towards the nucleus, where we fall, and then have a slight rise again right at the end of the word, because s is more sonorous than t. Also note that this is an instance in English where we have 3 consonants in the onset. So let's actually build this word up into a syllable tree, just for fun. Let's start with the vowels as the nuclei, then we'll fill up the onsets maximally. Then we identify the coda, we build our rhymes, and then finally we build a syllable. There's one final principle that we should talk about in this video, and that is syllabic consonants. Although nuclei are usually vowels in English, some consonants can be nuclei. In English, this is more commonly done with liquids and nasals. Let's take a look at the word insert. So, our first step is to write down the hierarchy values. We've got 0, 2, 1, 3, and 0. And let's mark all of the vowels as our nuclei. So in this case, we really only have the first vowel, I. So does that mean then that we just have a super complex coda, nsert? Well, the answer is no. I mean, the first thing to know here is that sr is really not a great sequence in either codas or onsets. It's not really possible in English, so that should be your first bet. But also, we know that liquids can act as syllabic units or as nuclei. And there's a little tick under it telling us that it's a syllabic consonant. So we know actually if there's this little tick that it is a nucleus. So we have another syllable. The question is, do we have the S, the S, as part of the first syllable, or is it part of the second syllable? Is it insert or ert? Note that although sr is a bad onset, s with a r nucleus is fine. Well, if we remember our maximizing the onset principle, we know that we want to put as many things as we can in the onset. Are we allowed to have s in the onset? Can we think of any words in English that start with just s? Well, what about silly? Note again, although there's words like strength and split, these don't have only s in the onset, so they are not proof that s is fine on its own. But words like silly do show us that s is a perfectly fine onset. Using maximizing of the onset as a good principle, we know that the correct syllabification is insert. So from here, we can actually build up the syllable as we normally would. So you find the onsets, the codas, build your rhymes, and then build your syllables. We're going to stop here for this video. There's actually a lot more to look at in terms of syllable structures, and cross-linguistic patterns, but for Ling 101, this is probably a good place to call it. Syllable trees really benefit from practice. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to upload some practice words with solutions that you can attempt in preparation for the quiz. I'll see everybody in the next lecture, though, where we'll be talking about allophones and complementary distribution. I hope you all enjoyed. Thank you.